Have you ever felt completely forgotten? As if the world had moved on, as if you had been erased from history, even though you're still alive? Ethan Crowe knew exactly how that felt. In the year 3249, Earth no longer existed. The human colonies were in ruins, scattered across hostile systems, orbiting stars that would never warm human hearts. The Human Alliance, once a proud defender of peace and intergalactic expansion, was now just an empty name. A distant memory of a time when we believed we mattered. Ethan, sitting alone in an old glass dome in the dark corner of a mined asteroid, watched the final transmissions of the Alliance with tired eyes. Nothing surprised him anymore. The intergalactic war pressed on. Cities fell. Ships vanished. And the alien species that once shared negotiation tables with humans now fired their orbital cannons without hesitation. He knew the end was only a matter of time. And then, when he least expected it, the call came. An encrypted message, signed with a name he never thought he'd hear again: High Command of the Alliance. Did it still exist? He doubted it. Probably just a desperate group, hiding in some doomed station, trying to put together a last-minute plan. A doomed one. But something in the message froze him. Ethan Crowe. Emergency authorization. Omega Protocol. Red code. You've been activated. Activated. The word echoed in his mind with a bitter taste. It had been 20 years since Ethan was last called by that title. 20 years since he stopped being a diplomat of the Alliance. 20 years since he decided to disappear. Why now? Because the Alliance had no more soldiers. No more leaders. No more generals. There was no one left. Only him. And that said a lot about the state of humanity. Development. Ethan didn't reply immediately. The message blinked on his console, persistent, but he just stared at the reflection of his own face on the darkened screen. Graying hair, unshaven, hollow eyes. Did someone really expect this man to save the human race? Slowly, he began to move. Cautiously, as if his body no longer belonged to him. He pulled a rusty suitcase from under the bed, a relic, full of memories he preferred to keep locked away. Inside, rested his old diplomatic badge, a silver pendant with the symbol of unified Earth, and a letter he had never found the courage to open. As he held the badge, the memory hit him hard. The day the war began. The neutralized planet. The secret mission. And the order he followed without question, which ended up costing billions of lives. Maybe it was only fair that now, at the end of everything, he was called to fix what he once helped destroy. Hours later, Ethan boarded an old freighter bound for the orbital station Tantalus 4, the last diplomatic outpost of the Alliance. There, he was received by unfamiliar faces, young soldiers, aides, technicians, all looking frightened and exhausted. None of them knew exactly why he was there. They were just following orders. Until, in a silent command room, someone handed him a file. 3 holographic images rotated slowly over the table. A Zahari warrior, wearing armor made from interstellar fang bones. A Keldar priest, with tongue-shaped tentacles wrapped in liquid light. And a Solari silhouette, faceless, expressionless, only eyes. Black as the void. 3 species. 3 enemies. They agreed to meet, a woman from the team said, looking at Ethan with hesitation. One last attempt at negotiation. But with one condition: it must be you. He raised an eyebrow. Why? Because they remember you. And in that moment, Ethan knew. This wasn't just a peace negotiation. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The conference room in Tantalus 4 was cold. Not just from the lack of heating, energy had been rationed for months, but because of the atmosphere of restrained despair. There was no optimism, only formalities. No one truly believed this would work. Ethan could feel it in every glance. As the files projected holographic images of the alien representatives, he listened to the analysts' descriptions, but his mind drifted. He knew these species better than anyone in that room. Not from manuals or military records, but because he had stood before them, looked them in the eye, lied to them, and now he would have to ask for forgiveness. The Zahari were the first to attack. A warrior race, forged on a hostile planet where only the strongest survived. They valued conquest, dominance, glory in battle. To them, peace was weakness. The very idea of the Alliance proposing a truce was nearly an insult. But something had forced them to the negotiation table. Perhaps the toll of war. Perhaps curiosity about why the old human had been summoned back. The representative who came to the meeting was Commander Rolvor, known as the Planet Burner. He had led the assault that annihilated Vesta Prime, the last human colony in the Urian system. Ethan remembered that name. He remembered the screams he heard over the radio before the destruction. The Keldar were different. Mystics, sensitive to the emotional fields of other species, they communicated through vibrations and mental melodies. For them, the war with humans was more than politics or survival. It was personal. Because in the Alliance's initial strike, 2 decades ago, a sacred temple of theirs was destroyed. Ethan had been there, on the first mission. He had sworn it was only going to be an inspection. But the orders changed at the last second. And the Keldar never forgot. Their envoy was High Priestess Silivaran, whose voice, they said, could paralyze even machines. She had lost 3 children in the first human bombardment. And then, the Solari, the most enigmatic of all. A race that did not speak, showed no emotion. Their bodies were wrapped in living cloaks that responded to their surroundings. They had sailed across the edges of the universe, silently observing other species for centuries. They were believed to be peaceful until they were attacked. It was after the incident with the Solari that everything collapsed. They never declared war. They simply began to strike. No warnings, no words, no diplomacy. The Solari delegate was known only as the voice of nothing. No face, no words, only presence, and a cold, incomprehensible rage. Ethan knew that with her, words would not be enough. As the 3 names were spoken aloud, Ethan stood and left the room. He walked out in silence, ignoring the stares and the questions. He went to the outer wing of the station, where he could see space through a transparent dome. Outside, 3 ships waited in orbit, each representing an empire. 3 imposing forms, black against the distant gleam of stars. They looked like shadows approaching a dying fire. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. They didn't come to negotiate, they came to judge. The mission was clear: try to convince them to sign a ceasefire treaty. But Ethan knew the truth: none of them were there for peace. They wanted to see the man who had deceived them. The man who, unknowingly, fired the first shot. And he couldn't deny it. Because, in a way, they were right. Vox Veritas, voice of truth. An ironic name for a ship shrouded in lies. It had once been the jewel of intergalactic diplomacy. A vessel built with the most advanced communication technology, empathic sensors, and energy shielding to host peace delegations in conflict zones. But now it was just a ghost drifting in the void. Ethan saw it for the first time in years as he approached in the transport vessel. The metallic structure floated silently, spinning slowly around a faded star. Part of its hull was corroded. Panels open. Artificial rust. The ship was alive, but dying. He knew it inside. Every corridor, every room, every scar. And it was there that everything began. As soon as he boarded, he was greeted by the ship's AI, LYRA, an archaic but functional interface system. Her voice, though mechanical, held a subtle echo of humanity, almost as if she missed him. Ethan Crowe. Identification confirmed. It's good to have you back. Not sure I agree with that, LYRA. You never did. He smiled, briefly. An involuntary memory. A time when he believed negotiations could change the world. That words carried weight. That truth had value. Now it was all about survival. The crew of the Vox Veritas was minimal. Just the essentials: 1 automated pilot, 2 engineers, 3 alliance officers, and a young diplomatic aide named Darren. 23 years old. An idealist. Spoke the way Ethan once spoke at that age. Full of hope. It was almost painful to hear. Mr. Crowe, it's an honor to be under your guidance. Let's hope that honor doesn't cost you your life, kid. Do you really think we're going to die? Ethan stared at him for a moment, saying nothing. Then he turned and walked toward the negotiation chamber. The heart of the ship was a circular chamber made of translucent panels that changed color according to detected emotions. Each chair was adjustable for different life forms. In the center, a raised platform awaited the mediator. Ethan's place. There, he sat alone. The ship was en route to the convergence planet, Isilmore, a neutral body in the border system between the 3 empires. An arid planet, devoid of life, but considered sacred ground due to its symbolic position on the star map. It was the only point where Zahari, Keldar, and Solari had agreed to meet. And even then, under protest. No one trusted anyone. Least of all a human. As hyperspace bent ahead of the ship, LYRA broke the silence. You still haven't read the letter, have you? No. It's been in the suitcase since you left Earth. Ethan closed his eyes. The letter. Handwritten by a dead friend. Someone who knew too much. Someone who, perhaps, had foreseen all of this. He had kept that letter sealed for 20 years. Afraid to read it. Afraid of what he might find inside. Afraid to discover that the truth had always been in his hands. It's not time yet, Elware. Maybe it never will be. He sighed, leaned back in the chair. The weight of the past was starting to press harder than ever on his shoulders. The Vox Veritas continued its course. Silent, solemn, like a tomb carrying the body of a man who still breathed. But for how much longer? Outside, in the ship's wake, 3 distant signals began to move. 3 ships, 3 shadows, following the Vox Veritas to Isilmore. Ethan knew those ships didn't bring good intentions. But he also knew he was the only one who could still try something. Even if he failed. Even if he died. Because sometimes, telling the truth is the most dangerous act in the universe. As the Vox Veritas moved through hyperspace, the distance between Ethan and the meeting point shrank. But within him, the space only grew. An ancient, painful void where memories he had tried to bury years ago began to awaken, like wounds that had never truly healed. It was on that ship. Exactly in that command room. 20 years ago. The mission was simple, at least on paper. Ethan, then a promising diplomat, was to be sent to a neutral planet called Ankarel, sacred territory of the Keldar. The Alliance had received an informal invitation to discuss mining agreements and safe routes through their borders. The goal was to begin a process of recognition and openness. But everything changed once they got there. The night before descent, a new encrypted message arrived from Earth. Direct orders from the High Council. Explore and retrieve structural data on religious facilities. Neutralize any potentially threatening technology if necessary. Ethan hesitated. The message seemed to contradict the mission's diplomatic principles. He brought his doubts to the mission commander, a rigid man named Alaric Thorne. Thorne silenced him with one sentence. Sometimes peace requires sacrifice, and trust requires strength. That morning, as Ethan descended with the team to the surface of Ancarel, he still believed he could prevent the worst. Believed he could negotiate, explain, find a way. But when they reached the sacred temple of the Keldar, the decision had already been made. Armed drones were deployed. The site was bombarded. Thousands of lives were lost. And Ethan, in the middle of the chaos, was powerless to stop any of it. To this day, he remembered the face of Scifi, the Keldar priestess. She looked at him the moment the temple dome exploded. Her arms were open, without fear, without words. Only eyes filled with a pain no human language could ever describe. Ethan never saw her again. But now, she would be among the 3 representatives at Isilmore, and he would have to speak with her again. In the Vox Veritas's resting cabin, Ethan opened the suitcase. The letter was still there, written by Yono's trainer, his closest friend during the Ancarel mission. A man who questioned the order, who refused to erase the mission records, and who was murdered weeks later under accidental circumstances. Ethan ran his fingers over the sealed envelope, took a deep breath, and opened it. The handwriting was firm, direct. Yonos wasn't poetic, he was honest. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means they called you back. You know why. You've always known. The mission in Ancarel wasn't just a mistake. It was a crime. And the council knew exactly what they were doing. There was something in that temple, something they wanted to destroy before the Keldar could use it. I don't know what it was. But I'm sure of one thing, if the war started there, maybe peace has to start there too. And you are the last living person who can do it. The letter ended with an access code. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was the activation code for the dark file of the Ancarel mission. A record that was supposed to be deleted, but wasn't. Hours later, in the command room, Ethan entered the code into the ship's console. A flickering image from 20 years ago filled the air. He saw himself, younger, walking through the temple halls. Behind him, soldiers with heavy weapons. In the background, muffled Keldarian chants. And then, the shot. The explosion. And the cry of a child. Ethan closed his eyes. Wanted to shut it off. But he didn't. Because now he needed to remember every detail. When the video ended, Lyra broke the silence. You could have erased this record. I should have. Why didn't you? Ethan took a deep breath. Because deep down, I knew I'd have to watch it one day. Now, with the truth in hand, Ethan understood what was at stake. It wasn't enough to negotiate. It wasn't enough to make promises. He would have to confess. He would have to admit that humanity started this war, and do so in front of the very ones he had betrayed, even if the universe never forgave him. As the Vox Veritas moved through hyperspace, the distance between Ethan and the meeting point shrank. But within him, the space only grew. An ancient, painful void where memories he had tried to bury years ago began to awaken, like wounds that had never truly healed. It was on that ship. Exactly in that command room. 20 years ago. The mission was simple, at least on paper. Ethan, then a promising diplomat, was to be sent to a neutral planet called Ancarol, sacred territory of the Keldar. The Alliance had received an informal invitation to discuss mining agreements and safe routes through their borders. The goal was to begin a process of recognition and openness. But everything changed once they got there. The night before descent, a new encrypted message arrived from Earth. Direct orders from the High Council. Explore and retrieve structural data on religious facilities. Neutralize any potentially threatening technology if necessary. Ethan hesitated. The message seemed to contradict the mission's diplomatic principles. He brought his doubts to the mission commander, a rigid man named Alaric Thorne. Thorne silenced him with one sentence. Sometimes peace requires sacrifice, and trust requires strength. That morning, as Ethan descended with the team to the surface of Ancarol, he still believed he could prevent the worst. Believed he could negotiate, explain, find a way. But when they reached the sacred temple of the Keldar, the decision had already been made. Armed drones were deployed. The site was bombarded. Thousands of lives were lost. And Ethan, in the middle of the chaos, was powerless to stop any of it. To this day, he remembered the face of Scifi, the Keldar priestess. She looked at him the moment the temple dome exploded. Her arms were open, without fear, without words. The planet Isilmore rotated slowly under the dim light of a distant sun. Lifeless, its terrain was arid, covered in dark fissures that looked like scars left by ancient battles, or perhaps unspoken prophecies. Vox Veritas landed with the minimum crew allowed. Security protocol: the fewer human lives on the ground, the lower the chance of an incident ending in massacre. Ethan descended alone. He wore his old diplomatic uniform, now faded and adapted to the rarefied atmosphere. On his chest, the symbol of unified Earth still shone, a blue star encircled by rings. But to the eyes awaiting him on the other side of the plane, that symbol was a reminder of death. The Zahari had set up their reception base atop a black stone elevation, surrounded by living banners that fluttered without wind. Their ships were massive structures, almost organic, with exposed weapons and towers that rose like thorns. There, at the top of the hill, stood Ralvor, the legendary commander, known to humans as the Planet Burner. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, clad in armor made of carved bones, many of them human. Every part of his body was a declaration of war, and every movement a threat. Ethan approached slowly, alone. 2 Zahari soldiers tracked him with narrowed eyes, ready to strike at the slightest sign of disrespect. But Ralvor did something unexpected. He descended from the platform and walked toward him. Human. His voice was like crushed metal. "You still live. A flaw I intend to correct soon." Ethan stopped in front of him. The height difference was absurd. But he didn't avert his gaze. "You accepted the meeting. Then speak." "I accepted it because I want to look into the liar's eyes before killing him." A brutal silence fell between them. To the Zahari, respect was earned through resistance. Any sign of submission would be seen as weakness. Ethan knew that. He knew he had to respond, with control, but also boldness. He stepped forward, met Ralvor's eyes and said, "You have every right to hate me, but you don't have the right to destroy what's left of my species without hearing the truth." Ralvor growled. The soldiers nearby tensed, ready. "Truth? Your kind spits out truths that shift with the wind. You destroyed 3 of my worlds. And I was there when we destroyed the first. And Carol." Ralvor paused. That name was known even among the Scifi, not for its strategic value, but for the impact it had on the balance of power among the empires. The destruction of the Keldar temple was seen as a provocation to the gods, a sign that humans were unpredictable, dangerous, and unworthy of any alliance. Ethan continued, "The attack wasn't an accident. It was an order from the Human Council. We were sent to provoke. I followed orders and stayed silent. And that brought us here." For a brief moment, Ralvor said nothing. His jaw moved slowly, as if chewing Ethan's name. Then he spoke. "If it's redemption you seek, you came to the wrong place. The Scifi do not forgive. But we respect courage." He turned, walked back toward his stone platform. Before climbing, he looked over his shoulder and said, "Today you live. Tomorrow we'll see." When Ethan returned to the Vox Veritas, the crew awaited anxiously for answers. "What happened?" Darren asked, eager. Ethan simply replied, "He didn't kill me." "That's good, right?" "No. That's a maybe." In the space above, the Scifi ship continued orbiting silently. Ethan knew that the first obstacle had been just that, the first. 2 encounters still lay ahead. And the next would be with those who hated him most. The Keldar. The Keldar reception chamber resembled nothing Ethan had seen before. While the Scifi displayed strength and brutality in everything they touched, the Keldar seemed to weave their presence through silence, light, and vibration. Their structures floated gently above the ground, made of bioluminescent filaments pulsing in soft hues, as if space itself breathed with them. Ethan walked carefully. Every step was monitored not only by eyes, but by emotional sensors. The Keldar were naturally empathic. They felt others' pain. They felt guilt, fear, lies. With them, there was no pretending. Ahead, Scifi waited. Tall, slender, with iridescent skin and eyes that seemed to contain galaxies. She wore a cloak of living fibers that reacted to every emotion around her. When Ethan entered, the cloak turned dark, almost black. She said nothing. She simply extended one thin hand, signaling him to approach. At the center of the room stood a memory altar, a Keldarian artifact that projected feelings through sound and color. It was there that emotional truth would be tested. Ethan stood before her. Scifi still hadn't spoken a word. Then, the voice came, not from her mouth, but directly into his mind. "You were at Carol." "I was." "You saw the temple fall." "I did. And I did nothing." "And why now do you seek us?" Ethan took a deep breath. Because if the war began that day, then perhaps peace must begin there too. With the truth. Scifi stepped closer, touched the altar. Ethan was overtaken by a wave of intense sensations. Pain, grief, fear, rage. Images floated around him, the burning temple, bodies on the ground, the distant echo of interrupted chants. But these weren't just memories, they were the real experiences of Keldarian victims. Ethan felt every one of them. Felt the pain of a mother who lost a child. Felt the horror of a child suffocating beneath the rubble. Felt the emptiness of an elder whose spiritual home was erased. And then came the final question. Do you regret it? He fell to his knees. Not by choice, but from emotional impact. Tears streamed down his face, not from physical pain, but from a truth that had finally found space to be spoken. Yes. Silence. Ethan continued, voice weak but steady. I regret obeying. I regret staying silent. I regret surviving when so many died. And if the only thing I can offer is acknowledgement of guilt, then that's what I bring." Scifi watched him for a long time. Then, for the first time, she walked to him, extended her hand, and helped him to his feet. Pain doesn't disappear, but it can be heard. She turned to the altar and activated the ritual of acceptance. It was subtle, a shift in color, a lighter vibration, a barely perceptible melody echoing through the floor. But to the Keldar, it was the deepest gesture possible. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was listening. Ethan returned to the Vox Veritas, exhausted. "How did it go?" Darren asked. "Like bleeding on the inside, and still walking." "Did they accept you?" "They heard me, and that's more than I expected." But one last meeting still remained. The most enigmatic, the most dangerous. Because with the Solari, words were not enough, and nothing could prepare him for what would come next. The third encounter came without warning. No greeting, no protocol. Vox Veritas was simply approached. No prior communication, no threats. A beam of energy pierced the ship's hull, opening a rift that became a corridor of black light. Ethan understood the invitation. Or perhaps, the command. The Solari did not operate under human logic. They had no words, no faces, and yet, they appeared in every historical archive as the silent observers of the universe. For centuries, it was believed they did not interfere. Until Earth was attacked. No declaration of war. No negotiation request. Only destruction, calculated, cold, perfect. Ethan walked through the corridor alone. The path led to an environment that was not exactly a physical space, but a mental interface. He realized he wasn't walking with his feet, he was moving with consciousness. Everything around him shaped itself according to his thoughts, flashes of the past, ruins of Earth, faces he didn't remember forgetting. There, at the center, was the voice of nothing. A figure wrapped in pulsating shadows. It had no defined shape. It was a presence, a sensation, a watching consciousness that needed no eyes to see, no ears to judge. And suddenly, Ethan felt, not pain, not fear, but total exposure, as if every layer of his mind was being read, stripped, dissected. There was no dialogue, but he understood the question. Do you wish to be judged? Yes. Why now? Because there's no time left. Do you seek forgiveness? No. Only understanding. And then, images surrounded him. They weren't his memories, but those of the Solari. He saw the Temple of Ancarol from the perspective of their invisible probes. Saw the decision being made before the mission ever launched. Saw the Alliance Council analyzing Caldarian artifacts and deeming the Solari an indirect threat, for being too close, for silently observing, for knowing too much. It was a cold decision. To destroy Ancarol, as a message. Not to the Keldar, but to the Solari. Ethan fell to his knees. Now he understood. The war with the Solari had not started by accident. It was provoked, premeditated, because human fear of the unknown was stronger than ethics. Then, for the first time, the voice of nothing spoke. Not with sound, but with truth. You know, and you continue. Even so. Yes. Then you are different. The light around Ethan slowly faded. He was back on the ship. Alone, unharmed, but changed, and on the screen before him, a single message from the Solari blinked. Presence authorized for final session. They would come to the table, not out of trust, but because they recognized something in Ethan that they may never have seen in a human before. Truth, without defense. When Darren saw him return, he rushed to him. "Are you okay? What happened in there?" Ethan took a moment to respond. "I was judged, but not condemned. And, will they listen?" "Yes." "Do you think they'll accept an agreement?" Ethan looked at the stars beyond the hatch, and answered, "I think now / it depends only on what I say." The moment of truth was near. 3 empires waited for a proposal, and Ethan carried not a plan, but a confession as his only weapon. The Conclave of Ruin earned its name for a reason. It was there, on Isselmore, that great alliances had once collapsed, where treaties were broken, where silent wars began with false handshakes. Now, once again, the 3 great empires, Zahari, Keldar, and Solari, would gather. But this time, there was no alliance to preserve. Only the final breath of a species, and a man who carried both guilt and hope. The Convergence Chamber was a semi-subterranean dome built by an extinct civilization. It resembled a black stone shell, with entrances designated for each species. No being inside felt comfortable. That was intentional. That was symbolic. Each delegation occupied a wing. Ethan, at the center, alone. No entourage, no weapons, no shield. Only himself and the truth. Before him, the faces and faceless of those who held the power to decide Earth's fate. Ralvor watched like a patient predator. Scifi floated in rigid serenity, and the voice of nothing simply was. Unfathomable. The silence lasted nearly 2 minutes. Then Ethan spoke. "I'm not here to beg, nor to persuade. I'm here because I must be." He paused, looked into the eyes of each one, even when there were no eyes. 20 years ago, I took part in a diplomatic mission to the planet and Carol. A mission that, secretly, was ordered to provoke, to test the reaction, to destroy. The temple wasn't destroyed by mistake. It was a deliberate attack ordered by human leaders to send a message of strength. The atmosphere of the dome shifted. Emotional fields reacted. The light on the walls flickered. I knew, and I stayed silent. And for that, I take responsibility, not just for my actions, but for everything you've come to hate about humans: arrogance, fear, lies. Another silence. Then he pulled something from his pocket, Yono's trainer's letter. He read a passage aloud. If the war began there, perhaps peace must begin there too. Ethan continued, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a choice. You can destroy what's left of my species. You have the power to do so, maybe even the right. But if you do, you'll have defeated an enemy already dead. Or, you can allow the truth to be recorded. Let future generations know what happened. Let your names go down not as destroyers, but as those who listened even when everything screamed for vengeance." The final voice wasn't his. It came from Scifi. Audible, this time. Faint, but clear. The temple will not be restored, but the cycle can be broken. Ralvor slowly rose. His gaze was like stone. "If you break this treaty, I will burn what remains of the sky." Ethan nodded. "Then I won't break it." The voice of nothing said nothing, but a symbol appeared in her presence, a circle divided by 3 lights. It was silent acceptance. The agreement was sealed. A provisional ceasefire. A chance. A maybe. But for Ethan, it was enough. Because sometimes, standing at the edge of the abyss, the only thing one can offer is truth. And that is more than the universe ever expected. The news of the ceasefire spread too fast. Within hours, encrypted human frequencies, once silent, began bubbling with confused messages, contradictory orders, and widespread distrust. Not everyone was ready to accept peace. Not everyone believed that a single diplomat had achieved the impossible. And, as always, there were those who preferred chaos. Vox Veritas was preparing to take off, bringing Ethan back to Station Tantalus 4 to formalize the treaty records when the sensors detected an anomaly. 3 unidentified human ships were rapidly approaching Isilmore. Security codes do not match any official fleet, LYRA reported. Militia? Darren asked. Ethan already knew the answer. No. Dissidents. Extremist human groups had been forming for years, fueled by the collapse of the Alliance and hatred toward the alien empires. One of them, called the Circle of Pure Earth, believed that any agreement was treason, and that the only solution was total annihilation of the other species. Now, they were here, with stolen nuclear warheads, and a clear mission: destroy the Conclave and restart the war. Ethan knew the alien empires wouldn't hesitate in the face of a threat. A single hostile move, and everything would be lost. We have to intercept them, said Ethan. How? Our ship has no weapons, Darren replied. But it has something they don't. What? Ethan looked at him with the weight of the world in his eyes. Me. Vox Veritas changed course. Flew straight toward the dissident ships. Ethan recorded an emergency message, broadcast on all human frequencies. This is Ethan Crowe. If you fire, everything we still have dies. Not just hope, but the chance to exist. I've made mistakes. We all have. But today, we have a choice. Either we trust in something greater than fear, or we return to darkness. Silence. But the missiles were armed. Ethan did the only thing he could. He detached the diplomatic capsule from the ship, entered it, and piloted it straight into the firing field. LYRA, record this. If I don't come back, deliver the recording to the Conclave, and tell them that at least one human chose not to fight. The capsule accelerated. The missiles were launched. Ethan intercepted them with the capsule's energy shield. The collision was immediate. Light. Silence. Nothing. Darren screamed over the radio, without answer. The capsule disappeared from the sensors. Ethan was gone. In Isilmore's orbit, the dissident ships retreated. Afraid. Confused. The attack had failed. The Conclave was spared. And in the meeting chamber, for a moment, the 3 alien leaders shared the same feeling. Not pity, but respect. Vox Veritas returned to the station alone, with a recording, and with a name that, now, would never be forgotten.